We're going to look at Daniel 11:45 and Daniel 12:1. There is some significance with this passage and what we're studying, or at least depending on your understanding of the Euphrates, it becomes very significant. But as you notice here in the verses that I've pasted there, I've taken the verse 45 and 12:1 out. Because as we know, these things punctuations were placed there by compilers. I know you've got to have chapters, headings and verses, etc. But I believe this flows. I believe it's a continual discussion or that Daniel is making here. And this is how I understand it grammatically to read. Speaking about the king of the north, he says in verse 45 of Daniel 11, he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, that's Jerusalem. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. And this is Daniel 12:1 now. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. So the study is not so much on these verses. However, we understand Michael standing up to be the close of probation. I mean, if there's folks online who are not sure of that, we can always study that another time or even in the break. But Michael is Jesus, the great prince that standeth for the children of God, the children of thy people. And when he stands up, it means the end of probation. Actually also means, as previously in Daniel 11, that he's about to receive his kingdom. That's why he comes as King of Kings. And when he stands up, probation ends and people's destinies are sealed. And that's it says, there shall be a time of trouble such as never was. In other words, the 7 last plagues are going to fall. So if we read this grammatically, as I believe it, we should, that means whoever the king of the north is, you understand him to be, when he comes to his end, probation closes, Michael stands up. However, if whoever you believe the king of the north to be is some power or whatever that continues after probation closes, if that's your interpretation, then obviously you have to disconnect Daniel 12:1. You have to, grammatically, obviously. I mean, that goes without saying. If the king of the north continues, goes through the plagues, is destroyed at a later period, whenever, for example, many teach it's the papacy. The papacy does not come to its end when Jesus stands up. 2 Thessalonians 2 tells you when the papacy comes to its end. He's consumed by the brightness of Christ's coming. And we'll look at that as well, today's passage as well. He's cast into the lake of fire, cast alive into the lake of fire. So the papacy does not come to its end at the probation closes, but at the end of the plagues. So if we can understand this point, I'm not asking people to agree, but if you can see grammatically, those words, and at that time shall Michael stand up, have to refer to what was just stated there regarding the kingdom of coming to his end. Another reason why I believe it's chronological is because the entire Daniel 11, the entire chapter, is not only literal, but it's also chronological. It's historical, literal, and chronological. There's no symbols in Daniel 11. A king means a king, north means north, south means north-south. The glorious holy mountain is Jerusalem. Daniel tells you that in chapter 9. For example, Daniel 11 begins with Xerxes, the Persian king, and his ill-fated idea of invading Greece, which led to the end of the Persian Empire, was Alexander the Great rose up sometime after that to take vengeance, and they certainly did. So you go from Xerxes or Persia to the Greek Empire under Alexander. Alexander passes and he has 4 generals that divide his empire among themselves. They, after some time of some internal struggles among each other, become 2 powers. And the kingdom that is then becomes the kingdom of the north, which is Seleucus, and the kingdom of the south, which is Ptolemy. And that's the first time you read about the king of the north and king of the south. This is the Greek Empire. Then you move on. It's following Daniel 2, 7 and 8. You move on, and of course, Iron Rome was next on the scene, and you have the great general Pompey, I think it's verse 16, conquering Jerusalem, entering the glorious land, or 63 AD. Then you read about the exploits of Julius Caesar and how he would return to his homeland, as he did. And he actually died in Rome, as the Bible brings us out again. This was a long time before these men were even alive. After Caesar, you have his grandnephew Octavian, who went into a civil war against Mark Antony, was successful, and he became the great Caesar Augustus, the greatest Caesar Rome ever had. He then has a son who Augustus did not want in any way to succeed him. Augustus called him a vile person. Daniel 11 called him that. Thousands or hundreds of years, if not maybe more, before Tiberius Caesar was even born. When you get down to Tiberius Caesar, you get down to Christ's day. And in fact, when you get to verse 22 of Daniel 11, you have the crucifixion of Christ. Then it moves on. What I'm showing you is the chronology. It's chronological of history. You move on and you have the medieval period, or the Dark Ages, the 1260 years of papal persecution, etc., and the whites and the saints being tried and made white, etc. And you come to the time of the end, 1798. And you have the battle between Napoleon when he conquers one battle, the Battle of the Pyramids, in 1798, right at that time. The King of the South pushes against him. And with one battle, Napoleon marched straight into Cairo. It went on to say that the King of the North would come against him like a whirlwind. And the very next year, 1799, the Turks came against Napoleon. And he was involved in a freeway battle with the King of the North, the Turks, and also the Egyptians and the King of the South. And of course, he was successful at first, and then he was failed in the siege of Acre, which was an Ottoman city at that time. And he ended up going back to France, left an army that was perishing with disease, etc., who eventually surrendered to the British and to the Turks. And the King of the North, the prophecy says, continues on into the glorious land in Egypt, etc., it shall overflow and pass over. And it brings you down to verse 45, the final verse of Daniel 11. And when you get to Daniel 11, verse 45, we read, he, the King of the North, shall come to his end, and none shall help him. And at that time, Michael shall stand up. So I believe that when it says, and at that time, it's referring to the King of the North coming to his end. This is why I've left out the heading there, because you can see how it reads very clearly. Notice this now. This is from Uriah Smith. Now notice how he comments on what we've just been talking about. A definite time is introduced in this verse, talking about Daniel 12:1. Not a time revealed in names or figures which specify any particular year or month or day, but a time made definite by the occurrence of a certain event with which it stands connected. Now look what he says. And at that time. What time? The time to which we are brought by the closing verse of the preceding chapter. The time when the King of the North shall plant the tabernacles of his palace in the glorious holy mountain. And when this event takes place, he is to come to his end, and then, according to this verse, we look for the standing up of Michael, the great prince. So this is how he saw it. He's just reading it grammatically and chronologically. At that time refers to the King of the North coming to his end, Michael stands up. And of course, you may be asking, what has this to do with Armageddon and the Euphrates? Our pioneers, great degree, Stephen Haskell, A.T. Jones, Uriah Smith, others, they believe the King of the North was Turkey. In fact, I do as well. Although I believe it's more than just Turkey, but a coalition of Islamic forces. I believe that big nations, because of other prophecies in the Bible, like the 83rd Psalm, like the prophecy regarding Ishmael, etc. They also believe that Turkey was symbolized by the Euphrates. They believe the Euphrates referred to Turkey. And therefore, because the sixth plague is the drying up of the Euphrates, they saw that as a drying up of the Turkish Empire. So they made Daniel 11:45 the sixth plague, the drying up of the Euphrates, because they believe that the Euphrates represents Turkey, and that's where Turkey, or the King of the North, comes to his end. And incidentally, I'm not criticizing anyone here, not by any means. These were men that were great men of God, sacrificed tremendously, and left us a great heritage. So please don't think that for a moment. I'm just sharing with you history. And no one's infallible, and prophecy is progressive. All truth is progressive, especially prophecy. And this simply wasn't for their day. If I was alive at their time, I'd have been teaching exactly what they were teaching, because they had some pretty good reasons for it, we're going to see. But today, 150 more years on, it doesn't hold up anymore. So here's Stephen Haskell. The drying up of this river, it's the Euphrates, notice what he says, or the Turkish nation, is equivalent to Turkey's coming to his end and none shall help him. That's Daniel 11:45. Elder Haskell understood that to be the king of the north to be Turkey. He understood the Euphrates to be Turkey, and therefore the drying up of the Euphrates is the end of the king of the north in Daniel 11:45. Obviously, that's the sixth plague. And here we have Stephen Haskell again. When the Turk steps out of Constantinople, because obviously the king of the north's got to move from his capital to Jerusalem, and that's what they were watching, that's what they were waiting for. They felt it was going to happen very soon in their time. So when the Turk steps out of Constantinople, there will be a general breaking up of Europe. They may not name this impending conflict the Battle of Armageddon, but God has so named it. So once again, we see how they were viewing what was happening in their day, and they saw it as a fulfillment of prophecy, and that the end of the world was at hand. Armageddon was coming. And as the Turk stepped out into Jerusalem, he would come to his end there, breaking up of Europe. There'd be a showdown, and Armageddon would take place. But what I want you to notice with why I'm showing you this is, we saw two statements now from Stephen Haskell. Now, if he understands Daniel 11:45 to be the end of the king of the north, which is Turkey, which is the drying up of the Euphrates, which is the sixth plague, obviously, you got to cut Daniel 12:1 off, obviously. Because Daniel 12:1 is when Michael stands up, the plagues haven't fallen yet. So there's no way you can read them chronologically. It's impossible. I mean, this is common sense. And that's what these brothers were doing. Because they were so sure of prophecy being fulfilled, they had to, they believe in Daniel 12:1, but not in connection with this event. They can't, because they're telling you Daniel 11:45 is the Euphrates drying up, the sixth plague. And of course, Michael standing up, which is before the plagues fall, cannot be in sequence or chronological. You have to detach Daniel 12:1. And now why am I bringing that up? Because it's still being taught today by many. Those who teach that the king of the north is the papacy, they have to cut Daniel 12:1 off as well. Otherwise you have the papacy come into its end before probation closes, before the plagues fall. And this is Jim Brown, a current scholar on the subject, which I agree with a lot of the things this pastor actually teaches. So again, I'm not criticizing. But notice what he says. Yet he shall come to his end, king of the north. Notice what he's got there in the brackets. The drying up of the great river Euphrates during the sixth plague. He wrote that, not I. And none shall help him. This is plain Daniel 11:45 language. He's telling us that the Turkey is going to come to its end, king of the north, and he's calling it the sixth plague, drying up the Euphrates. Now remember, we saw Uriah Smith made this point that I believe is correct. We talked about a definite time being introduced, and that time is the king of the north coming to his end, closing verse of chapter 11. And he says, the time when the king of the north shall plant the tabernacles of his palace in the glorious holy mountain, when this event takes place, he is to come to his end, which is Turkey. And then, according to this verse, we look for the standing up of Michael, the great prince. Now, this is Daniel and Revelation commentary. Here he's placing Daniel 12:1 chronologically after Daniel 11:45. He's saying the king of the north is going to come to his end, that's Turkey. And then we'll look for Michael standing up. But then look what he does later on in the same book. It is so used in other places in the scriptures. In this latter text, all must conceive that the Euphrates symbolises the Turkish power. So Elder Smith is telling us the Euphrates symbolises Turkey, not the Turkish power. And now he states, the drying up of the river in this sense would be the consumption of the Turkish Empire. Not only that, accompanied with more or less destruction of its subjects. Why? Watch this. Thus we should have literal judgments upon men as the result of this plague, that's the sixth plague, as in the case of all the others. Notice the previous plagues. So previously in the same commentary, Elder Smith tells us that Daniel 11:45, king of the north comes to his end, and that definite time introduced Daniel 12:1 when it says, and at that time shall Michael stand up, follows on. He made that clear, we saw it twice. Now in the same book, when he tells you that Turkey is the Euphrates, or the Euphrates symbolises Turkey, he's telling us when Turkey is consumed, it's the result of the sixth plague. So you can't have it both ways. I don't know how this wasn't seen or corrected, or I don't know how you could explain this. I don't think you can, it's impossible. But nonetheless, as I said, these are not different editions, it's the same book, same edition. He tells you first that Daniel 12:1 follows Daniel 11:45. King of the north comes to his end, probation closes. And now here, later on, in his commentary on Revelation, he tells you King of the north's coming to his end because of the sixth plague, the Euphrates, drying up. And obviously, you've got to go off Daniel 12:1. So why I share this little segment here is just to show that your understanding of Daniel 11:45 could influence the way you understand the sixth plague. And as I said, like it's happening today, you'd have to disconnect Daniel 12:1 from that previous verse. The mistake, I believe, isn't so much the identity of the King of the North, but the mistake is making the Euphrates a symbol of Turkey. I mean, we saw our opening map. The Euphrates flows from Armenian mountains through Turkey, through Syria, and through Iraq. So if that's your only reason, then you could justifiably use one of those other nations that represent the Euphrates. But there's more objections as well. But nonetheless, making Euphrates symbolise Turkey coming to its end at Daniel 11:45, obviously, that's the sixth plague, therefore you can't have Daniel 12:1 following, which is close of probation. The plagues haven't fallen yet. Again, this is Stephen Haskell and Jean Brown, just refreshing, just to remember. Drying up of this river, the Turkish nation is equivalent to Turkey coming to its end. So again, you see they're applying Daniel 11:45 to the Euphrates of the sixth plague drying up. And Jean Brown, he'll come to his end, the drying up of the great river Euphrates during the sixth plague. So the simple point I'm trying to make over and over again, if you understand it this way, even if you don't think it's Turkey, but if it's some other power, papacy or whatever, you have to disconnect Daniel 12:1, and I believe that is extremely inconsistent. I can understand our pioneers having gone down that path, because as I said, they were watching the Ottoman Empire shrinking, and it was really shrinking. The Ottoman Empire was a very large empire. It encompassed Egypt in the south, Greece, Bulgaria, the Balkans in the north, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel. Notice this map here. Notice how vast it was. North Africa, Libya, Iraq, parts of Arabia, or the inhabitable parts of Arabia, except for the desert. It was huge. They went all the way to Vienna. Very big empire. And for many hundreds of years. In our pioneers' day, notice their expansion of the Ottoman Empire. Notice the acquisitions there, the different years, the different conquerors, etc., how large it was. In our pioneers' day, this is how it was looking. It was basically Turkey. See the yellowish colour, whatever. There you see it there. All the rest is losses. Losses to Russia, losses to Britain, losses to Italy, losses to different nations with different battles. And the borders had shrunk to basically Turkey itself. And so if you understand Turkey to be the Euphrates and the Euphrates drying up, you're going to get excited in their day watching this happen. And no wonder they, as I said, I wasn't criticising. They saw it that way, but they had to cut Daniel 12:1 off to hold to that interpretation. They had to. And so they saw that as the drying up, the sixth plague was coming and Armageddon was coming. Now, there's a lesson, I believe anyway, in this. It's a lesson, and it's something that, a principle that I use in Bible study, not just in prophecy, but for anything, but especially Bible prophecy. We may have different interpretations, of course, etc., until God reveals more light, and if we're humble, we'll come to unity. But in any study, especially prophecy, you've got to look for pillars or landmarks. And that's what keeps you safe. You can have certain connections that look really good, like they had some really good connections, really good ones, but they're huge mistakes. Friends, if they were alive today, there's no way they'd be teaching this. We're going to see how powerful it is today. It's one of the most powerful nations on earth. It certainly isn't shrinking. There's no way they'd be teaching it today. We're fortunate because in hindsight, we're living 150 years on to see that Turkey did not shrink and dissolve and finish up. Anyway, the point I'm getting at is we look for landmarks, and then the other connections we make or we're studying, they have to be consistent with those. And to me, Daniel 12:1 is a pillar. He shall come to his end and none shall help him. And at that time, Michael stands up. How else am I supposed to read that intelligently and honestly? How else? I cannot conscientiously read that any other way. God wrote it God specifically made it read that way. King North comes to his end in the glorious holy mountain in Jerusalem. He comes to his end. And the next thing you read is, and at that, what time? When he came to his end. At that time, probation closes. So whatever your interpretation is of Daniel 11:45, it has to come to its end, whoever that power is. And then Jesus stands up. And it's wonderful. A lot more I could share on that, which makes it even stronger. Because remember, I want to drift a little bit here, but Remember, just before the end, Jesus, a few times in the Gospels, it talks about a period of peace and safety. That doesn't make any sense at all. Peace and safety. Right at the very end, when there's famine and floods and war and earthquakes and everything is happening. And the Bible talks about this peace and safety period. If you can understand this part of the King of the North a bit better, you can understand maybe why there's a little interlude there to keep people deceived. Anyway, as I was saying, they were excited to see what was happening. That's what was left of Turkey. And then you had World War I, which pretty well was the end of Turkey, as far as they just were a sovereign nation. They weren't even a sovereign nation for a little while. There was these treaties drawn up, and basically it was all carved up among the other nations. Even the Australians, as we know, fought there in the Dardanelles there at the Bosra. So if you have a pillar like that, don't rub it out to fit your interpretation. Hold to that, and maybe your other interpretation is wrong. This is the point I want to bring up. When Turkey got to that point, especially just after the First World War, they were called the sick. In fact, before then, they were called the sick man of Europe. Today, they are the 8th most powerful military nation on earth. Some people list them at 10, depends on what list, but nonetheless, they're very powerful. The top 10, you're talking Russia, China, America, of course, England. They're just behind those sort of nations. That's how powerful Turkey is. Iran's powerful. Turkey is more powerful militarily than Iran. She certainly is not the sick man of Europe, one of the most powerful nations in the world. And it's not you see the way Erdogan speaks. So what I'm getting at is the Euphrates drying up represents Turkey. Well, it's certainly not drying up at the moment.